Bodies were unearthed in a Guyana jungle, revealing a mass grave untouched for days. 913 people died in 1978, the largest mass suicide in U.S. history, orchestrated by Jim Jones' cult. Yet the cult had concealed the plan for years, hiding it in plain sight. Investigators later found documents detailing a decades-long scheme to lure followers to a remote compound. The People's Temple, Huizhuang as a humanitarian group, manipulated 1,000+ members into believing death was a path to salvation. Founded in 1955 as a Christian church in Indianapolis, the People's Temple evolved into a shadowy, controlling group that lured followers to a remote jungle in Guyana. Jim Jones, its leader, preached racial equality and social justice, but by the 1970s, his sermons had turned into a web of fear and manipulation. Survivors later described how he used propaganda, threats, and even forced labor to keep members in line. The U.S. government had quietly investigated the group since the 1960s, but no action was taken until March 1978. That month, Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Jonestown with journalists to investigate claims of abuse. What he found would shock the world and change the course of American history. The cult's plan had been years in the making, with cyanide-laced flavor aid prepared in advance, hidden in bottles labeled as soft drinks. Yet, even as the massacre unfolded, the Guyanese government allowed the group to settle in exchange for promises of agricultural development. The bodies were exhumed, days later cremated, and the truth buried with them. But the survivors, like Jeanette Quintero, would carry the scars of Jonestown for the rest of their lives. Jim Jones, born in 1931 in Louisiana, was a charismatic preacher who founded the People's Temple in 1955 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Initially, the group championed civil rights and racial equality, drawing followers from marginalized communities. Jones' early sermons blended Marxist rhetoric with Christian doctrine, promising a utopian society free from discrimination. By the late 1960s, the cult had grown to thousands of members, but its public image began to sour as Jones grew increasingly paranoid, blaming external forces for the group's challenges. In 1971, the temple relocated to Redwood Valley, California, where it expanded its influence, but tensions with local authorities over property disputes and tax evasion led to FBI surveillance. Jones, fearing exposure, began plotting an escape. In 1974, he secretly moved the cult's leadership to Guyana, a remote South American nation, under the guise of creating a socialist paradise for its members. The Guyanese government, led by President Forbes Burnham, welcomed the group in exchange for promises of agricultural development, unaware of the cult's true nature. Control within the temple was absolute. Jones used a mix of propaganda, fear, and violence to suppress dissent. Survivors later described how members were isolated from the outside world, forced to work in grueling conditions, and subjected to psychological manipulation. Larry Schaefer, a co-founder who left in 1974, testified before Congress about the cult's brutality, including forced labor and beatings. He warned that Jones had become a dictator who viewed any criticism as a threat to the group's survival. The U.S. government, including the FBI and State Department, had quietly investigated the temple since the 1960s, but political pressures and a lack of clear evidence prevented intervention. By 1977, however, the cult's activities in Guyana had drawn international attention with reports of abuse and missing U.S. citizens. Yet no action was taken until March 1978, when Congressman Leo Ryan arrived to investigate. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock the world. The airstrip at Jonestown was silent when Congressman Leo Ryan's plane touched down on March 26, 1978. He had come to investigate rumors of abuse, forced labor, and missing U.S. citizens. With him were journalists, including NBC's Gary Weir and members of a U.S. congressional delegation inside the compound. The air was thick with tension. Cult members, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow, listened as Ryan demanded answers. When he pressed for the return of American citizens, some members wept, others glared, their hands twitching near hidden weapons. That night, Ryan and his group boarded a plane to leave. But as the engines roared to life, a crowd of cult members surged forward, blocking the exit. "You're not leaving!" one man shouted. A struggle erupted. Shots rang out. Weir, the reporter, was among the first to fall, his body slumped near the fuselage. Ryan, bleeding from a chest wound, tried to retreat but was shot dead. 3 others, 2 aides and a nurse, were also killed. The plane took off without them. Back in Jonestown, panic spread. Jim Jones, his face pale, ordered his followers to prepare for the end. In a chillingly calculated move, the cult had stockpiled cyanide years earlier, hidden in bottles labeled Flavor Aid. Children were told it was a special drink to celebrate their new life. By dawn, 913 people, 276 of them children under 12, had swallowed the poison. Some vomited, others collapsed within minutes. Jones, gripping a gun, shot himself in the head as the final survivors fled into the jungle. Jeanette Quintero, 14 at the time, hid in the undergrowth, her breath shallow. She watched as her mother drank the poison, her hands trembling. "I didn't want to die," she later wrote. "I just wanted to live." Of the 1,200 people in Jonestown, only 1,014 escaped. The rest were buried in mass graves, their bodies exhumed days later by the Guyanese government and cremated, erasing the tragedy from the earth. But the cyanide had been prepared years in advance, a detail no one noticed until too late. The Guyanese government's response was swift and calculated. Within days, officials exhumed the bodies from mass graves, stacking them in pyres that burned for hours, reducing the remains to ash. Survivors who had fled into the jungle were rounded up and repatriated to the United States, their return marked by a media frenzy that turned them into pariahs. Jeanette Quintero, then 14, described the journey home as a nightmare of stairs and whispers. In the U.S., survivors faced relentless scrutiny, interviews with psychiatrists, FBI interrogations, and public shaming for abandoning their families. Some were accused of being brainwashed by the cult, a narrative that ignored the coercion and fear that had trapped them in Jonestown. The U.S. government, meanwhile, faced its own reckoning. In 1981, a congressional inquiry revealed that the FBI and State Department had known about the People's Temple's activities since the 1960s. Files showed that agents had tracked the group's movements, noted its violent tendencies, and even warned that the cult may be preparing for a mass exodus, yet no intervention was made until the massacre. Former FBI Director William Webster later admitted the agency had failed in its duty, citing political pressures and a lack of clear evidence. For survivors, the trauma lingered. Children who had survived the cyanide-laced Flavor Aid often struggled with depression, substance abuse, and dissociative disorders. Quintero, in her memoir, wrote of a slow unraveling of the soul, describing how the cult's manipulation had left her haunted by the faces of those who died. Yet, the Guyanese government's role in allowing the cult to settle in exchange for agricultural promises remained a shadow over the tragedy. Survivors and historians continue to debate whether Burnham's regime had been complicit, trading human lives for economic gain. The massacre, they argue, was not just a failure of U.S. oversight, but a betrayal by a nation that had invited the cult into its borders. The Jonestown tragedy left an indelible mark on American history, becoming a chilling case study in the psychology of mass manipulation. Scholars now dissect the People's Temple's collapse as a textbook example of how charismatic leaders exploit fear, isolation, and ideological extremism to control followers. In 1982, the U.S. government established the Jonestown Memorial in California, a quiet stone structure where survivors and families gather annually to honor the dead. The site, funded by survivors and scholars, includes a plaque listing the names of the 913 victims, though many remain unverified due to incomplete records. Each year, survivors like Jeanette Quintero speak at the memorial, their voices trembling as they recount the day they watched their loved ones drink poison. The massacre also reshaped U.S. policy on cults and mental health. In the wake of Jonestown, Congress passed the Cult Awareness Act of 1984, though it was later repealed for its controversial definitions of cults. The FBI overhauled its protocols for monitoring extremist groups, and mental health professionals began scrutinizing the psychological profiles of charismatic leaders. Meanwhile, the Guyanese government faced quiet international criticism for allowing the People's Temple to settle in the 1970s, a decision tied to economic promises that never materialized. Survivors, still haunted by the cult's manipulation, have since lobbied for greater transparency in how governments handle religious groups. Today, the Jonestown Massacre is a cautionary tale etched into history books and documentaries. Films like Jonestown, The Death of America's Cult, and The Killing of Sister George, 1983, dissect the tragedy's layers, while academic journals continue to analyze Jones' leadership style. Yet, for the survivors, the story is far from over. Jeanette Quintero, now in her 60s, still attends the memorial, her eyes scanning the names of the dead. "We were told we were saving the world," she says softly. But we were the ones who needed saving. If this story gave you chills, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss another mystery. Drop your theory in the comments below.